Pam Bondi is Trump's nominee for U.S. Attorney General, and she's a controversial choice for the Second Amendment community. Many leading members, people I know and respect, feel strongly that Bondi is a horrifically bad choice due to her past support of various gun control measures, and that she has advocated for those measures is beyond question. I consider myself a Second Amendment absolutist and believe all gun control laws preemptively applied to law-abiding, mentally sound American citizens are unconstitutional. That said, I also think that Pam Bondi is far from the horrific choice many are making her out to be. Let's talk about the Second Amendment truth of Pam Bondi and the good news. I am, of course, Attorney Andrew Branca for Law of Self-Defense. And before we jump in a few minutes, I'll share with you how you can get a free copy of our best-selling book, The Law of Self-Defense Principles, so keep your eyes open for that. Okay, so first let's talk about who Pam Bondi is. Bondi is a lawyer who began practicing law in 1990, right around the same time I did. She spent a number of years as a Florida Assistant Attorney General, so a local criminal prosecutor. In 2010, Bondi was elected to be the Attorney General of Florida, a position she held for 2 four-year terms, at which point she was term limited out of office. She then joined a private law practice that was engaged in registered lobbying and public policy litigation. Bondi has long been a strong supporter of Donald Trump. She endorsed him for president in his first 2016 campaign, served on his transition team following his election, and was part of his legal defense team in the first impeachment against him. Now, of course, she's been nominated by Trump, newly elected to the presidency for the third time, to be the United States Attorney General, the head executive overseeing the U.S. Department of Justice and all subsidiary agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her Senate confirmation hearing was held this past week, and even the Democrats opposing her grudgingly informed her that they can count and that it was very likely she would be confirmed as U.S. Attorney General. So that's kind of a 30,000-foot view of her technical qualifications for the position of Attorney General generally, and I don't think it can be contested that those credentials are pretty stellar. The problem for Bondi with the gun community is that she has in the past come out speaking favorably for gun policies that the community correctly views as hostile to the broadest reading of the Second Amendment. They therefore consider her a poor choice of Attorney General because of what they perceive as her lukewarm support or even outright hostility to Americans' gun rights. These objections have been particularly loud amongst many whom I consider leaders in the gun community, as well as personal friends of mine. Let's consider the possible YouTube account, Iraq Veteran 8888, my buddy Eric. Here's me on Eric's YouTube show just a few weeks ago. Eric posted this on X about the Bondi nomination, and I'm quoting him here. I don't care how qualified Pam Bondi is, I won't be on record for supporting someone who is anti-gun and who has backed unconstitutional measures in the past. The importance and sanctity of the Second Amendment won't allow me to overlook that just because she is Trump's rubber stamp. And he adds, y'all can fall on that sword, I won't. And we also have this from longstanding leader in the gun community, Dana Lash, who I've also met personally and who has kindly had me on her popular show as a guest on multiple occasions. Dana writes on X, this is very concerning. Pam Bondi is seen here advocating for red flag law, a complete obliteration of due process. Removing natural rights requires a process of adjudication that red flag denies. Now, I want to state up front that I'm not here to say that Eric or Dana or any other similar voices raised an objection and alarm over Pam Bondi are wrong. They are neither wrong nor are their concerns misplaced. I'll go even further and say that I wouldn't want to live in an America that didn't have exactly the kinds of zealous and adamant defenders of the Second Amendment as Eric and Dana. We need them, and we are blessed to have them. I pray that they never stop their vigorous and uncompromising advocacy for our gun rights. What I do want to do in today's show is offer an alternative perspective on the nomination of Pam Bondi for U.S. Attorney General in the context of our Second Amendment rights that leaves me less concerned than some others. Before I even get to Pam Bondi, however, I'd like to talk about having reasonable expectations generally of both politics and politicians. We each have our own political views, And the more thought we've given to those views, the more rigidly we tend to be bound to them, and the less wishy-washy we tend to view political questions. But what's true of an individual's political views is not true of society's political views generally. Society's political views are far less rigid and far more amorphous, as one would expect when we consider political views in the context of 340 million individuals rather than any single individual. Further, the amorphous nature of the collective political view makes it subject to change and manipulation over time, driven by people's views and responses to world circumstances, national events, and of course, the relentless propaganda we're continuously exposed to, especially in the current age of social media, fed to the smartphones that are never more than a few feet from us at any time. So, whereas the individual political perspective is often more of a silo, the collective political perspective is often more akin to a soup. Well, politicians are not elected by any particular individual. Politicians are, in effect, elected by the soup. And in seeking to be elected, politicians are, in effect, selling themselves to the collective soup in an effort to get the majority of that soup to vote for them. It should become pretty quickly apparent that any politician who largely appeals only to a narrow silo of political perspective is limiting his appeal within that soup and therefore is less likely to win election. And this becomes more true the larger the soup pot. This reality is reflected in the different political dynamics for an election based on a relatively small demographic base versus a larger demographic base. A U.S. House race, for example, is based on a single congressional district. It's not unusual to have such a relatively constrained district have a general commonality in political perspective, because a large majority of the district may share similar demographics, concerns, and community. So someone running for the U.S. Congress might do well to take a siloed political approach that's well aligned with the narrow political perspective of that district. Success, you won. But the broader the constituency, the less effective the silo approach works. When one is not running for a U.S. congressional seat, but for a U.S. Senate seat, now one has to appeal to the electorate of an entire state. And that's far less likely to be politically homogenous than any single congressional district. And of course, when one is running for election at a national level, now one has to appeal to the electorate of the nation generally. And that's also true when one is seeking appointment to a national level position. In both Pam Bondi's position as the Attorney General of Florida and her current nomination to be Attorney General of the United States, she is necessarily bound to seek the approval not of any single silo of political perspective narrowly, but of a broader constituency of political support generally, at least if she wants to win that statewide office or be deemed appropriate for the nationwide position. What all this boils down to is this: the prospects that anyone, no matter how well technically qualified, could successfully win a statewide or national level position while being an absolute hardliner within any political silo approaches zero. I'll go even further and say not only is it unlikely, it ought not be expected, because that's just not how politics works in the real world. Whatever our own political silo, we'd all like to imagine that we could take a political candidate who shares our silo, elect them to office, and they'll fix all the things in the system that, in our view, are broken. But that's just not how things work. I believe it's a terrible mistake to believe that we can just elect good people to a bad system and the outcome is going to be a good system. What happens in reality is that the relatively few good people available to be chosen are either unable to gather the political support necessary to fix the bad system, or are themselves exhausted and ultimately corrupted by that system. I view the practical, desirable political machine, because it is a machine, rather differently. What we want, I think, is not a quixotic belief that good people can fix a broken system. What we want is a model in which we have a good system that compels even weak and corruptible politicians to make the right choices because the system itself finds the wrong choices unacceptable. To put this all in automotive terms, it's less reasonable to expect that high-test fuel will make a bad car run well than to expect that a good car will perform reasonably well even with fuel of lower quality. Now, I didn't invent this perspective of politics. I first learned this perspective from a very smart man, economist Milton Friedman. He urged that we accept that our politicians cannot reasonably be expected to be pure and righteous, to always be the right people. Instead, he urged, we should accept that we need to make it politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right things.
You know, people have a great misunderstanding about this. People in Congress are in a business. They're trying to buy votes. They're in the business of competing with one another to get elected. The same congressman will vote for a different thing if he thinks that's politically profitable. You don't have to change Congress. People have a great misconception in this way. They think the way you solve things is by electing the right people. It's nice to elect the right people, but that isn't the way you solve things. The way you solve things is by making it politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right things.
I agree with Milton Friedman that this is a much more realistic view of politics than is the notion that we have any realistic chance of electing politicians that strongly favor our own political view silo over those of the many millions of other people from whom they are also seeking votes. Now, with that framework in mind, let's again consider Pam Bondi's nomination for U.S. Attorney General in a Second Amendment context. I'll focus here on the single greatest complaint being made against Bondi, and that was her support for so-called red flag laws. Currently making the rounds is a video of Bondi seated beside then-President Trump in his first term in a 2018 meeting in which they're favorably discussing these red flag laws. Here's the relevant portion of that video.
We are going to bring in something called the Gun Violence Restraining Order. So if someone is civilly committed, typically you can hold them for up to 72 hours, but people are getting out within 24 hours, the majority of them. So what we want to do is let law enforcement come in and take the guns.
Good.
They're a danger to themselves.
Which you can't
or
do
others.
right now.
Well, without being adjudicated. So because they're a danger to themselves.
You want them to take the guns and
when they are
not go through 6 months of legal trials and everything
exactly
else.
But we also have to give the mentally ill the due process in which they deserve, President. So what we're doing is they're going to be able to take the guns when they're taken into custody or into the hospital, and then when they're released within 24 hours or 72 hours later, typically it's 24 hours, but law enforcement will have 72 hours to determine whether they should give those guns back, or they can go to a judge and say, Your Honor, please keep these guns. We feel this person is still a danger to himself or others, whether
So
they're
this
in
would
or out
not
of
have
custody.
worked the way it's currently constituted. This would not have worked with Cruz as it's currently constituted.
As it's currently written.
So you're going to make changes?
We're going to make changes.
Now, I think it's important to recognize that the amorphously named red flag laws are not a single homogeneous thing. Indeed, I expect it's fairly common that two reasonable people can look at these so-called red flag laws and see two different things. A classic example of two people seeing two different movies on the same screen. For many people, especially those not particularly invested in matters Second Amendment, red flag laws translate into keeping guns out of the hands of crazy people. And frankly, I expect that if we use that definition, even Second Amendment advocates would agree that we don't need guns in the hands of genuinely insane people. Anyone who's ever dealt with someone experiencing a genuine psychotic episode where they genuinely believe that the humans around them are hostile, reptilian aliens intent on eating their brains would think, I agree, that a person in such a mental state is not well suited to keeping and bearing arms. People who are genuinely a danger to themselves and others ought not have access to guns. The difficulty arises because those Second Amendment advocates have a very different perspective of so-called red flag laws. Our community tends to see these as little more than a pretextual means to strip American citizens of their right to keep and bear arms in a near total absence of anything we would recognize as due process of law. Your ex-wife doesn't like your new girlfriend? Well, she can just ring up the local cops, make up a story about you being dangerous, and they'll come and take all your guns away. In our view, and I'm explicitly including myself here, if someone is genuinely a danger to themselves and others, the solution is not to simply seize their guns, because seizing their guns doesn't make them non-dangerous to either themselves or others. If someone is genuinely dangerous, they need to be institutionalized. That's the only way to ensure that absent their guns, they don't simply start stabbing a bunch of people, or driving their car into a crowd of people at a Christmas parade, or making an IED with instructions off the internet. Under that model, the due process protections that exist to prevent people from being wrongfully institutionalized would prevent the so-called red flag laws from being used as a mere pretextual excuse for gun seizures. Here's the thing. For someone not strongly invested in a Second Amendment view of the world, the support of red flag laws likely means, to them, crazy people ought not have guns, and not let's pretextually seize the guns of people without due process of law. I expect that's how Donald Trump was viewing the phrase red flag laws in the video of his meeting with Bondi, and I expect that was also Bondi's view. It's also worth noting that the meeting in question, where this exchange on red flag laws between Trump and Bondi took place, occurred on February 22, 2018. That means it took place literally a week after the Parkland school shooting that occurred in Florida on February 14, 2018. Literally the worst school shooting that has ever occurred in America, in which 17 students were viciously murdered by Nicholas Cruz, an insane person with an AR rifle, and 17 other people seriously injured. Bondi herself, as Florida's Attorney General at the time, was on the school property immediately after the shooting, when 17 families had to be called and told their children were never coming home. Naturally, the state of Florida was horrified at what occurred, and as people are prone to responding in such situations, they want something to be done. Pam Bondi was, again, the elected Attorney General of Florida at this time, the key word being elected. That means she's voted for and represents not just the political silo of Florida that consists of hardcore Second Amendment advocates. If that was her only political support, she'd never have been elected AG in the first place. She was elected by a much broader range of the Florida electorate, many of whom felt more strongly horrified at the insane massacre of school children that had just occurred than they did about the constitutional and moral imperative of the Second Amendment. Now remember, for many people, likely even most people, the phrase red flag law does not mean we're coming to take your guns without due process of law, but rather it means crazy, dangerous people shouldn't have guns. In that latter context, perhaps the most normal thing in the world for both President Trump and Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi to do in the days immediately after the Parkland massacre by a lunatic with a gun is to advocate for the red flag laws that they believe serve the purpose of keeping guns out of the hands of genuinely crazy, dangerous people. Now, I'm not asking any of you, I'm certainly not asking Eric or Dana to adopt that view. They and I know what red flag laws really mean. But there is an alternative understanding of what red flag laws mean, and in that perspective, can we really conclude that the position of Trump and Bondi at that meeting was simply their expression of Second Amendment animus, that what drove their view of red flag laws was a hatred for the Second Amendment? Or is it possible that their position of red flag laws was based on a view that all of us, including Second Amendment advocates, would probably agree ought to be a non-controversial view? That people who are genuinely crazy and dangerous to themselves and others probably ought not be armed with guns in that moment. I would also suggest that it's important to keep another timeline element in mind here. The Parkland shooting and the remarks between Trump and Bondi in that video all occurred in 2018. That means they all occurred a full 4 years before the seminal 2022 Supreme Court decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, which recast the entire legal and conceptual framework of the Second Amendment for the first time, explicitly imposing the conditions of history and tradition in determining the constitutionality of any challenged infringement of the Second Amendment. Might Trump's and Bondi's comments have been different following Bruin than before Bruin, especially for a lifelong lawyer like Pam Bondi? This past week, Bondi sat through a full day of questioning during the Senate hearing on her nomination to be U.S. Attorney General, including a great deal of incredibly hostile and theatrical questioning by Democrat senators, many from states with grossly unconstitutional gun control laws. I watched all of the hearing, and I was frankly surprised at how few questions were asked about any Second Amendment issues, including red flag laws. The single closest thing to substantive questioning came from California Senator Alex Padilla, California being a gun control state, of course, who did ask about things like raising the age to purchase guns and red flag laws, both of which, of course, a gun control advocate like Padilla fully supports. He asked if Bondi would support such initiatives on a national level. I found Bondi's response to be both reasonable and informative. Bondi could have, in fact, was being baited into providing full-throated support for those kinds of gun control initiatives on a national level. And she did nothing of the sort. Let's watch.
Next, questions on the topic of gun violence, which continues to be a challenge and a problem in many parts of the country. As you know, the Department of Justice plays a key role in enforcing federal gun laws and working to prevent gun violence. In the wake of the Parkland shooting in 2018, you expressed support for certain gun control measures in Florida, including raising the minimum age for firearm purchases and implementing red flag laws, which I agree with, I support. They're proven to make a difference and to save lives. How would you use the position of Attorney General to advance these common sense gun safety policies on a national level?
First, Senator, let me say I am pro-Second Amendment. I have always been pro-Second Amendment. I will follow the laws of my state of Florida and our country, of course, regarding any gun laws. I worked that shooting, meaning I was there when 17 family members were notified. I was there that their children were murdered. Also, Pulse nightclub. I also went to Nevada to help with the MGM shooting. The Attorney General at the time asked me to come out there. I believe over 60 people were murdered there. I am an advocate for the Second Amendment, but I will enforce the laws of the land.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I would certainly hope so. But any specific ideas that you have on advancing the common sense gun safety proposals that you support as you were Attorney General? I gave you two examples: raising the minimum age for firearm purchases or implementing red flag laws. There's, I think, a growing national consensus on universal background checks.
I would be glad to meet with you and review any legislation that you have, Senator.
Okay. All right, I only have a few seconds left, but thank you for your testimony. I know we asked some tough questions in this hearing. That's what the confirmation hearing process is supposed to be about. I know how to count and I know how to read tea leaves. It seems to me you're very, 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 very likely to be confirmed, and certainly look forward to working with you in your office on the issues that I've raised today and more. And I certainly look forward to seeing you demonstrate the independence and respect for the rule of law that you have suggested to the committee today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And my prayers are with you in California again on the horrific fires and what you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Combat them.
Now, I also want to note Senator Padilla's closing remarks, in which he notes that he can count and read tea leaves, and effectively concedes that Pam Bondi is very, very likely to be confirmed as the Attorney General of the United States. So the real question for all of us in the gun community is not, should Bondi be approved as AG or should she not be approved? Absent some shocking development, she will be approved. It's also worth noting that it's not a question of whether Trump should replace Bondi with some other candidate for AG. That's just not politically feasible, especially considering that Bondi is already Trump's second nomination for AG after Matt Gaetz stepped aside. A third choice would signal overwhelming weakness in the incoming president. Also worth noting is that while we in the Second Amendment community naturally take a narrow view of such nominations for sound and obvious reasons, Trump is and must necessarily take into consideration far more variables in his choice of AG. Of course, one set of variable must be the candidate's technical qualifications, which in the case of Bondi seem unquestionable. Also important, of course, is the personal relationship and trust between Trump and his nominee for Attorney General. And this is all the more important given that in Trump's first term, he found himself saddled with two attorneys general who could fairly be characterized as being politically opposed to his presidency, those being Attorney General Sessions and Attorney General Barr, both of whom Trump would ultimately sack at considerable cost of political capital. The best way to avoid this occurring again would be for Trump to place a very high value on his personal relationship with this incoming nominee for Attorney General, and it's difficult to imagine any AG candidate with the qualifications of Pam Bondi with whom Trump has a longer or closer relationship. Remember, she was part of his legal defense team in his first impeachment trial in his first term as president. Another consideration here brings to mind the expression that you can tell a lot about a person by the nature of their enemies. The very hostility directed at Pam Bondi by the Democrat senators in this past week's nomination hearing and her steadfast and confident rejoinders to that hostility can only be described as music to my ears. Now, in the video clip we just saw, Bondi describes herself as having always been pro-Second Amendment. But of course, support is somewhat of a continuum. Do I believe that Pam Bondi is the kind of Second Amendment absolutist that Eric is, or Dana, or myself? A level 15 on a scale of 1 to 10? Absolutely not. But I also don't believe a person of such intense commitment is likely to have found themselves to be in a position to be a nominee for Attorney General of the U.S. in the first place. Certainly, I wasn't offered the job, and I think it's safe to presume that neither Eric nor Dana were offered the job either. I would characterize Bondi as being a mostly favorable pro-Second Amendment supporter, perhaps a 6 or 7 on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, to many in the Second Amendment community, that's the equivalent of being a Second Amendment traitor. No compromise on the Second Amendment is acceptable to us. But our Second Amendment community has not the political power to compel our perfect candidate to be the Attorney General of the United States. And by the way, I'd put President Trump himself at just about that same level of Second Amendment support, at 6 or 7 out of 10. Trump's sons might well be right at the same 15 level as Eric, Dana, and myself, but Trump, we should remember, is a lifelong New York City Democrat, not someone immersed in America's gun culture. I've personally watched Trump speak at various gun industry events, including several annual meetings of the NRA. And of course, Trump knows that it is pro-Second Amendment Republicans who elected him president, not gun control Democrats. But Trump also agreed in his first term to ban bump stocks. I consider this a terrible violation of the Second Amendment. But the propaganda equivalence of bump stocks to fully automatic machine guns was seductive to the general public, and probably to Trump, that's been conditioned to have an irrational fear of fully automatic arms. And Trump is not elected solely by Second Amendment absolutists. Would I prefer that Trump himself was a 15 on guns on a scale of 1 to 10, that Bondi was a 15? Of course. But that option is not on the table. What I see on the table in both Trump and Bondi are two moderately favorable Second Amendment politicians who are admittedly susceptible to political pressure on gun matters. We don't have the option of replacing them in the moment. What we can do, however, is surround them with a vigorously pro-Second Amendment political legal framework, especially through the uncompromising Second Amendment advocacy of people like Eric and Dana, and to a lesser capable extent myself, as well as many others too numerous to name here, and also the increasingly favorable line of Supreme Court decisions most recently culminating in Bruin with the goal of doing the following. Not by merely trusting them to make the right calls with respect to the Second Amendment, but in making it politically profitable, indeed politically imperative for them to make the right Second Amendment calls, regardless of how ambiguous their personal feelings on the matter might be. And frankly, I don't think that's a terrible place to be, especially given that I believe Trump can expect the full and uncompromising support of Bondi throughout his presidency, and perhaps just as important, Trump's nominee for director of the FBI, The contentious but wonderful Kash Patel is also a close personal and professional friend of Pam Bondi, and Patel can therefore expect her full and uncompromising support in his efforts to flush out the currently thoroughly politicized and corrupt leadership at the Bureau. Sitting here today, that's an arrangement I can live with. I'll close out by reminding all of you that if you carry a gun so you're hard to kill, that's why I carry a gun so I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to know the law so you're hard to convict as well. Until next time, I remain Attorney Andrew Branca at lawofselfdefense.com. Stay safe.